Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Find out how RANE can help you stay ahead of global events at ranenetwork.com.
10 years ago, yes, this was rocket science. Today, doing these genetic manipulations is not that hard. So the fear is that in labs, if they're not receiving federal or other governmental funding, there isn't any control on it.
Welcome to the RANE Insights podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for tuning in. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we brought you a weekly podcast debunking misinformation and sharing best practices from two of the world's leading infectious disease experts, Dr. Bill Lang and Dr. Fred Southwick. The pandemic is not over, but it certainly raised people's awareness of infectious diseases and also the hunger for information about emerging diseases. So this podcast is looking beyond COVID to update you on the new and the next emerging infectious diseases and what businesses should know. Let's listen to today's podcast.
Fred and Bill, once again, thanks for spending some time with us. There have been a number of headlines just in the last few days about the variants of COVID, and these are receiving some prominent media coverage. Washington Post, for example, Axios, NPR has been playing this up. What can you tell us? And I know we've shared between ourselves in advance of this podcast. But what should we be thinking about? What can you share with us so we can separate maybe, the fact from the fiction and separate, undue alarm?
Well, David, what the Washington Post article got to, and they're not the only source, as you said, there have been a lot saying this, is that there is a high risk for new variants over the course of the winter that are going to cause either increased severity of disease or increased escape from immunity. Now, even when you read through that, though, it's unclear what they're basing that on, other than just, well, we haven't had a lot of variants for a long time, so we're bound to get them. It really comes across to me more of a this could happen, so you really need to take care, and you've got to go get your vaccination. And this goes along with the CDC push for getting the additional booster, push for getting getting vaccinated in the first place, because the U.S. continues to have just about the lowest vaccination rate of the entire economically developed world. We're running at 68%. The average around the world for the economically developed nations is closer to 80%. Only 50% of those who are eligible for a booster have gotten a booster, and only 5% of those who are eligible for the new updated Omicron booster are eligible for that. So I think that some of this hype that we're seeing about the new variants, while probably true, we probably will see a few more variants, but the hype that these are going to cause huge new outbreaks is just that. It's hype designed to push the vaccine.
Problem is the following. This virus reproduces its RNA inaccurately. In other words, it makes frequent mistakes. And those mutations or changes most of the time will not have any effect on the ability of the virus to spread or to cause disease. But every now and then there is a mutation that does prove to be advantageous. That is, it will spread more easily. And there are certain regions of the spike protein that seem to be most important as far as affecting contagiousness. And those particular amino acids, I don't need to go into them, but there are specific ones. And it does seem that many of the mutant strains that are being described have mutations in these specific sites that enhance their function. So it makes sense that these variants would be presenting themselves. Whether they will be strong enough advantage to beat out BA5 and BA4 isn't really clear right now. There is a suggestion at the CDC mentioned that there is a variant. Again, these are all Omicron variants. There is a BQ1 and a BQ1.1 that now have grown to represent 11% of the virus strains causing infections in the United States. Now, when we get up to 11%, it does raise concerns that this could become the new dominant strain. The problem we have is that most people have not received the bivalent booster. That is the booster that has the Omicron variant BA5 sequence in it, as well as the wild type sequence. That is likely to be protective for almost all of these variants. And this evidence of some new variants coming up and becoming more prominent should encourage everyone that is eligible to get the bivalent booster.
And that wasn't the only sensational reporting that we were having. And I agree that I think the booster is useful for everyone, but that's not the only sensational reporting. Over the weekend, there was a report about in Singapore, was characterized as a new strain, XBB, is causing huge numbers of hospitalizations and deaths in Singapore. The Singaporean government actually came out with a clarification on Monday and said, number one, XBB is just BA 2.1. It's something that we've had experience with over several months, and it is not causing a huge outbreak. They have not had significant increased numbers. They did have one small outbreak that was event-driven, not variant-driven. So between those, they said this has not been this big sensational, and they actually accused the media of trying to create sensationalism. So XBB is not a nightmare variant by any stretch. It is something that it's a small variation of BA 2.1, and it's otherwise something we know about.
Well, what's interesting, I think our last podcast was a little bit more than 2 weeks ago, but we were specifically discussing the data that was coming from Europe and how to interpret it and reasons not to be alarmed. And then all of a sudden these headlines broke. And I recognize there's a bit of piling on that goes on with the media, and certainly it's these are attractive headlines for people to click and advertisers to attach advertisements to. But what is the certainly, and it's interesting, a lot of this seems to be coming out of Washington. I don't want to say predominantly, but I do note that Axios and The Hill and the Washington Post seem to lead some of these stories. What is the data from Europe actually telling us now? And I know the last time we spoke was about 2 weeks ago. Is there anything new?
As of Monday, which I didn't relook at it again yesterday or today. As of Monday, the ECDC, the European CDC, was still tracking BA5 as far and away the driver of the largest number of cases, and they were not even reached the level of needing to track these XBB, BQ 1.1, or BA 2.75.2. It was BA5 and BA5 minor variants that were driving this, and not new major variants. And then when you go around the world, you see over the last week, cases are up very, very slightly on a worldwide basis, and even within the range of error, since we don't really know what the total number of cases are. So it's essentially flat, but it's not continuing down. But the major hotspots in the world are clearly Central European countries. And even most of them have looked like they're starting to turn down. Little unclear, still watching them very, very closely. but the places that were hotspots as recently as 3 weeks ago, which was Asia, probably actually even the last time we talked, the Asian hotspots, which included Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, case numbers have turned down there. The rate of increase has turned down dramatically there, and it's really only Taiwan that is still seeing the very high numbers of cases. Japan and South Korea have moderated to a great extent.
Because of the inaccuracy of the RNA reproduction, there is always going to be concern about variants. And I agree with Bill. I think there has been some sensationalization. And in academic centers, we aren't too concerned yet. But because of this unreliability and this ability to adapt to the vaccinations, there is a potential concern. It's maybe not as dangerous as been promoted by the press, but I think this is a realistic concern. And the fact that there's one variant that's at 11% is getting up there. When it gets to 20, 30, 40%, we'll really have to worry more about those variants. But I do think that, remember, the BA5 escapes, we've seen in the elderly, the BA5 escapes the standard immunization. And that's why I strongly recommend that everyone who is eligible should get the bivalent vaccine so that we do reduce the spread of BA5 and other variants, of Omicron variants, which were not covered by the original vaccines.
So let me, I love to underscore the counsel that you guys give. One, people should maintain the protocols of getting a booster vaccine when the time comes. Those who have access to the bivalent should certainly take advantage of it. There's no reason not to, from a safety standpoint. And in fact, I'm hearing you very ardently, both of you, urge people to do that. Third, you continue to monitor the data from around the world, and obviously things can change and change quickly. And to that end, I don't want to go down a geopolitical rabbit hole, but it is interesting, and we have a number of clients of RANE who obviously have significant activities in China, and a lot of listeners to the podcast have actually asked about this, but the data out of China, which continues to be, in lockdown mode, and recognizing they, have some very important meetings that are attracting a lot of attention, the People's Congress, et cetera. Is there anything that you guys are either interpreting, or I'll even use intuiting, from what's happening in China as a result of infection rates, their approach to this, and the possibility of other variants emerging?
China is a very large population, and the fear of one variant taking over and causing massive hospitalizations, China cannot afford that, and therefore they have been extremely conservative and have used methods, masks and social isolation, distancing, and avoiding public events more so than any other country. And I know they're criticized because it has interfered with their economic activity, but they have so much to lose because they're very crowded. The spread would be very, very fast. So I can understand their response to some extent. We're at the other extreme. We don't want any masks. We don't want any social distancing. We want to gather in as larger groups as we possibly can. And I think this does lead us to more deaths and more severe hospitalizations. And we do lead the world in the number of deaths. And that's one of the reasons. So there needs to be a balance between the U.S., which is too far in the freedom end, and China, which may be overly strict with regards to isolation and masks, etc.
Yeah, China's only reporting several hundred cases per day. And as you alluded to, their approach when they have a case, they'll shut down everywhere that is affiliated with that case, from neighborhoods to businesses to malls. And it is having a huge impact on economic activity. But as Fred said, the problem there is, especially as we have learned that vaccines only have a shelf life, so to speak, once they're injected, of about 3 to 6 months, somewhere in there, before they are not very effective against infection. They're still effective against preventing serious disease and death, but they are not very effective after 3 to 6 months in preventing mild infections. But mild infections can still lead to transmission. And so I think the Chinese are afraid that they could not bring new vaccines and even boosters online fast enough, given the size of their population, that if a major outbreak started, they could kind of get ahead of it, as we would in the US. And if they got into the situation where you have massive widespread infections of significantly undervaccinated people, they would have millions of deaths. At this point in the US, as Fred said, we didn't lock down, so we had these massive widespread infections affecting immune naive people, and we did have lots of deaths. Well, now we didn't do exactly what the Great Barrington Declaration said, which was basically let it rip. But in essence, we have now a population that has probably 80% of the population has some degree of immunity. It may not be perfect immunity, but it is probably fair immunity against serious disease and death. Plus, then we've got a reasonable amount of even those other 20% that are vaccinated to some point. So while we may never reach herd immunity, we've reached a point at which we are relatively protected, and we can have relatively normal economic activity in the country. David, one other thing that I did was I looked at what are the main reasons why conventional reason says that we will have an increase in case numbers over these upcoming indoor months. And 5 quick reasons. One, it's colder weather pushes people indoors. Once you get indoor, increased densities, that gives more chance to share virus. The second is that cooler, drier air associated with winter is more conducive to prolonged suspension of these aerosolized viral particles. So as you're getting more people together, the virus can actually stay in the air longer in a cool, dry room than it would in a typical summer environment. So more people and more virus at the same time. As Fred has noted, people have dropped the use of personal protective measures and personal protective strategies. This sense that we have had no new major variant just raises people's fear that we're due. We're due for another, not just another number variant, but a whole new Greek letter variant. There's no evidence that that's going to happen, but there's this fear that because it's been so long, we're due for it. And then the final of the 5 is that the original vaccinations are no longer significantly protective against the symptomatic mild infections. And we've had such a low rate of boosters. So those are the 4 reasons why the conventional, or 5 reasons why the conventional wisdom is that we're going to have a bad winter.
Understood. I'm going to ask you guys to maybe give a quick primer on a couple things, which is up until 2.5 years ago, we weren't dealing with any of this. And why does this virus continue to, I'll use a layman's term, mutate, but I think the notion here is that it does evolve and does respond to sort of survive and maybe even thrive in additional environments. And Fred, maybe you can sort of explain how this is and how people need to think about it.
Well, the virus is actually obeying survival of the fittest, the Darwin original theory, and that if a mutation renders the virus more capable of binding to the receptor sites, it's able, a lower concentration of the virus can cause symptomatic infection. And what we've seen as the variants have progressed is it has become more and more contagious. That is, one person originally could infect 2 to 2.5 people, then it got up to 3 to 5 people, and now it's at 10 to 15 people, or one person can infect. So it has gained a function, it's gained the ability to be contagious. And now the other advantageous change that's occurring is actually avoiding the immune response that is present in the population. And some of the variants of the Omicron have changed the proteins in the spike proteins conformation and what is seen by antibodies to an extent that it actually is avoiding or evading the immune response from the various vaccines. And that's why everybody needs to get the bivalent vaccine, which actually has a different stimulus, which is more similar to these variants that are now starting to circulate. So those are the two major ways that one virus takes over from the others. It either is more contagious or it's able to evade the immunity that is present in the population at this time. So those are the two worries. Now, the more people are vaccinated, the less the virus will circulate, the less likely are to select for these new gain-of-function mutants. So I think the name of the game is to get everyone that is eligible to accept and get the vaccine.
Right, and without being too simplistic, Fred, I don't want to insult your and Bill's background, but maybe a way for people to think about this is that these are living organisms that are looking for places to live and to thrive and to spread. And what you're suggesting is between vaccines and protective equipment, those are the barriers to nature, the natural evolution of the virus.
No, I agree with that, and Bill can comment as well. But that's the other. Remember, we've talked ad infinitum about the Swiss cheese model, and so we shouldn't just depend on the vaccine. We should use masks in public spaces. There's no cost to using masks, and I think when there's any increased activity, everybody should wear a mask for a while. And I think the one area that's a big problem is large gatherings. And we all enjoy gathering in big crowds for concerts and other big events, and they're a lot of fun. But if the activity goes up, I think we have to step back again and be cautious.
Well, welcome. The NBA season kicked off last night, Fred. So, it's arena time. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to get Bill's view. We were exchanging some messages during the week, and Bill referenced, and Fred, you may very well be aware of this, but Boston University was able to do a fairly simple gain-of-function modification to the virus that apparently could create an apparently much more virulent version. And this brings up the potential for bioweaponry, human manipulation, etc. And so, Fred, you used the term gain of function. Maybe we'll take a step back. Bill, can you just sort of define that term very simply for the audience and explain sort of the BU experiment and what your takeaway is from it? And obviously, Fred would love to get your comments as well.
Sure. Well, what BU was doing was exactly what many people believe that Wuhan University did. You do minor manipulations of the genetic code for the virus that cause geometric changes to the surface of the virus that either affect infectivity or cause the virus to have a greater detrimental effect on the infected person. So that's the gain of function research, externally creating genetic modifications that modify either the infectivity or the severity of the effects of the virus. So what went on at BU was they were doing this fairly typical research of doing gain of function research. They happened to be doing it, though, on the COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2. And this was picked up by British Daily Mail. That they noted in a report from this that it caused an 80% kill rate. Well, the point is it created an 80% kill rate in mice. And this virus tends to kill a lot of mice in the first place. So BU is in the past 48 hours has been pushing back very strongly against that, saying, look, that is a mice rate. That has nothing to do with the effect in humans. Somewhat obfuscating the fact that, they're continuing to do gain of function research, though. And so it's creating, again, a large amount of concern in politics and in the academic community about how much should we be supporting or even allowing gain of function research on potentially deadly pathogens, such as SARS-CoV-2.
And, again, Fred, please jump in. But reminding the audience, Wuhan lab was viewed as ground zero for the virus, and a fair amount of speculation about whether this was created in a lab or whether it was naturally occurring from the wet markets in China, et cetera. Still, I guess, something that has not been resolved to the satisfaction of many people. But what I'm hearing also from this, and Fred, your academic background and your involvement with, basically medical research, is that there currently aren't any rules that are governing this type of research, which, potentially has high impact consequences, unintended consequences, or maybe even intended by some labs. But right now there is nothing that oversees gain of function research in the labs covering viruses. Am I hearing that correctly, guys?
I think it's important to do this research because if we can figure out what steps lead to this the gain of function, then we can create predictive models which can be applied to natural gain of functions and predict what's going to happen if this particular strain does spread. So I don't, not doing the research is a mistake. Now, it's very important that infection control and isolation be very, very careful in those places, and they should be BL3 or BL4 level of containment. That's the important part. But I think it would be a mistake to forbid gain of function mutation research.
Yeah, by the way, I wasn't suggesting that. I was just trying to point out from what I've read and what I'm hearing from Bill, that there are no global standards around this or global controls around this. So like many innovative technologies, an issue to be addressed. Clearly worthwhile research, Fred, but what I'm also hearing from you is that sort of the appropriate standards, controls, oversight of such research have yet to be fully enacted, no less implemented.
Well, and David, the controls tends to be whoever's funding it controls it. And the problem is that it is not rocket science type of manipulation. I mean, 10 years ago, yes, this was rocket science. Today, doing these genetic manipulations is not that hard. So the fear is that in labs that are, if they're not receiving federal or other governmental funding, there isn't any control on it. They do research on it like they do any other biochemical research.
All right. Well, guys, thank you. A topic to be explored because we are going into the new and the next, and lessons learned from the pandemic. I appreciate the fact that not only are you continuing to watch the data, but share the insights and share sort of very calm and reasoned analysis. I will conclude, if I can channel both of you, is people should not forget not only the various vaccines that are available to them and take advantage of it, which also includes the flu shot. Is that correct? Particularly, Fred, I know you are keen on that, and some respected medical experts are out there beating the drum and talking about a potentially virulent flu season. So hopefully the audience hears that as a continuing message.
David, actually, whenever I do this with groups, I make the point that the evidence that we are going to have a bad flu season is actually better than the circumstantial evidence that we could have a bad COVID season. And flu, we know we can have a huge impact on by getting the flu shot. So I encourage everybody to go out and get a flu shot. And in fact, CDC just announced this week that I guess last Thursday, that we have seen flu rates in the surveillance laboratory system that have just gone above the baseline, and that is the traditional sign that we have entered flu season. And this is 5 weeks earlier than we had seen in most flu seasons prior to COVID. So not including just the last 2 years, but in seasons prior to COVID. So the evidence is looking like, unless we have a very high flu vaccination rate, we're going to have a bad flu season. I usually put off my flu shot until the middle week of October, and that's what I've done. I'm getting my flu shot, I believe, this evening on my way home.
I'm planning to get my flu shot too, very shortly.
Okay, don't ask the experts what you should do. Ask the experts what they are doing. Thank you for stepping forward. And Fred, I'll channel you in the conclusion here, which is that mask wearing is not just a potentially prudent exercise around COVID, but can also be helpful when you're traveling and large crowds during flu season as well. So I assume that advice applies to influenza.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the other good thing I can point out, David, because I always wear a mask, I am not feeling any negative social impact from doing that. People, I think, accept some people are wearing masks and some are not. So don't be embarrassed by wearing a mask.
Okay.
It could save your life.
Well, Fred, I particularly appreciate that to remind the audience. Bill, thank you so much for your thoughtfulness, your care, your continued monitoring, and look forward to reconvening in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Dr. Fred Southwick is an infectious disease specialist at the University of Florida College of Medicine. Dr. Bill Lang is an expert in public health responses to biological incidents. David Lawrence is the founder of RANE. And RANE is a risk intelligence company that provides access to critical insights, analysis, and support to ensure business continuity and resiliency for our members. Learn about RANE's market-leading risk intelligence products at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. And thank you for listening.